In other world news, voters in Mexico head to the polls this Sunday following an election campaign marred by repeated violence and attacks on politicians. A mayoral candidate was killed by a gunman at a campaign rally. The latest victim ahead of that vote was since late last year. More than 24 people who were running for office have been killed in the increasingly polarized nation. For more, we're joined now by Benjamin Smith. He's Professor of Latin American History at the University of Warwick. Thank you so much for being with us on the programme, Professor. Let's talk a little bit about what the polls are suggesting heading into this vote. Mexico's holding not only presidential elections this weekend, but legislative, local elections, as well as races for regional governors around the country. So the next president, though, in Mexico is likely to be a woman. So what are we expecting? It's a big question.
So we're expecting that a woman called Claudia Sheinbaum, who is running for the incumbent party, a party called Morena, she'll win. She's about 20% ahead in the polls. So I think there's very little doubt that she's going to win quite easily. There is some question over whether Morena will be able to win the legislature, but I think, again, it will manage it. The current president and his party, and Morena, is, frankly, fantastically popular for all the problems that it has been accused of bringing to Mexico.
Now, candidates have been quite literally risking their lives to stand for office. These elections described as the most violent in recent history. Why this uptick in attacks on politicians, particularly, and aspiring politicians?
Well, frankly, for the last 15 years or so, politicians have been shot and killed during Mexican elections. It has increased, I suppose, over the last 10 years or so. But it's mostly to do with organised crime groups that are attempting to muscle in on basically ways of extracting revenue from small villages, towns, cities in Mexico. We know a lot about the Mexican cartels. Well, the Mexican cartels have turned towards other forms of organised crime, including illegal logging, illegal mining, kidnapping, extortion. And in order to do this, you need the local politicians and the local police force on your side. So the kind of mayoral election, which are fairly kind of small things in somewhere like the UK, are actually quite important for these organised crime groups.
And the outgoing president had a policy, so-called policy of hugs, not bullets. That obviously hasn't been working in terms of reducing the number of killings in Mexico. So what can be done? What kind of challenges will the new government, the new president, be facing?
Well, I think there are two things to bring out here. One, people claim that it hasn't worked, and there's a fair amount of evidence in these recent elections that it hasn't worked. But in actual fact, homicides have declined over the last 3 years. So his argument is that it's kind of working. Secondly, it's a bit of a misnomer, the hugs not bullets. In actual fact, what AMLO has done is he's got rid of something called the federal police, and he's put in place, basically using the military as a police force. So there is a kind of high degree of militarization in Mexico, both against the cartels and against organized crime groups, but also principally against illegal migration. And it should be brought out that Mexico is now de facto working as another border patrol for the United States, using its own military to do that. So Claudia Sheinbaum, yeah, she does have an enormous amount on her plate, including organised crime, violence, but also issues of migration in the United States, whether she's going to actually put the military back in the barracks or whether she's going to keep them out on the streets.
And apart then from rising crime and immigration, as you mentioned there as well, what other kind of themes have dominated this campaign?
I mean, the reason really that Morena are going to romp home in this election is the economy, and particularly they've done two things. They basically created a social service, a kind of a social safety net. In particular, they've introduced pensions, which Mexico really had very minimally beforehand. And this has really changed dynamics in families. Suddenly, you don't have to look after your parents or your grandparents as soon as they hit 65. And the second thing is they've markedly increased the minimum wage. And these two things have got a lot of people out of poverty. It's not really that difficult to kind of understand why they're so popular. There's a fairly good reason for it.
And if we do see, as is likely, a female president, do you think that's really going to make any difference, really, to Mexican society in terms of perhaps indigenous communities and marginalised society?
I'm not entirely sure that it's going to make much difference to indigenous society, which still remains enormously marginalised. And in actual fact, I mean, something we're not talking about today is yesterday. They discovered that 27 indigenous policemen were shot in the very indigenous state of Chiapas in southern Mexico. But this is not even really remarked upon in the Mexican press. I mean, the indigenous people still will be marginalized. Whether it's going to change gender relations, I think that's up in the air. AMLO's government, the Morena government, the current incumbent, has not been terribly good on gender relations, particularly on prosecuting the wave of femicides, killing of women, that has gone on in Mexico. Whether Claudia Sheinbaum, when she comes to power, manages to turn that around, that will be of interest.
Benjamin, thank you so much for joining us. We'll have to leave it there for now. Those elections taking place on Sunday. That is Benjamin Smith, Professor of Latin American History at the University of Warwick. Thank you so much for your time on the programme.